Hey there. Today I'm going to be exploring some data about Victorian fiction. So I've got this data source here from victorianresearch.org. It's called At the Circulating Library. It's a pretty cool website. It's got a database of Victorian fiction from 1837 to 1901. And the data is nice and easily accessible in some CSV files. So kudos to them, to Troy Bassett, for making it so accessible. What I've done is just loaded this data here into a Knarr project, and I've got the authors that they have, the information about these authors during that time period, as well as the titles that those authors were publishing and who they were publishing them with and when, etc. And so I've taken some notes here, and I'm going to show you some of the things I learned while I was just sort of profiling the data. I started with a set of initial questions of things I might want to learn about the data, like who's the most prolific author, or how do those authors break out by gender, and what about publishers and how do they change over time, etc. So before I just jump in and share some of the things that I found, maybe I'll just help you get a sense of what's in the data using the filter grid here. So here we can see that we have sort of author names, their gender, their full names. We have this alt name field, which is pretty cool. It has alternate names authors might have published under, either pseudonyms like these, or sometimes they had like titles or married names or maiden names and things like that. We've also got information about like volumes. There's already sort of an interesting distribution here. Either you're kind of publishing one volume of a title or three. If you're going to go to two, it seems like it's more like you're going to go ahead and do all the work to get to three volumes. And we've got the titles here and other information like that. So the first thing I really started looking at was just like picking an author I actually knew, right? So okay, let's look at Charles Dickens, and he wrote a total of 21 titles, and here are them sorted by publication year. I can see Oliver Twist, I can see A Christmas Carol, one of my favorites, and other titles that he wrote. Now we can learn more about how his writing went if we break that out by publication year. So here we get a visualization of sort of how many titles was he writing per year, and we can see that he did a lot more work, it seems, maybe earlier in his lifetime, and then as he got a bit older, maybe the pacing slowed down a little bit. It was more spread out with the publications of his work. I think he had this one year in 1841 where he published 3 titles. Now, if we look at his publishers, though, so if he's publishing these books, the question I had was, well, who is he publishing them with? And you can actually see something pretty interesting here if you break this out by publishers across that period. So we can actually see that he jumped back and forth between 2 publishers in particular. He sort of early in the 1830s and 40s was writing for and publishing with Chapman and Hall, and then he sort of took a break from them and published for Bradbury and Evans for a while, and then went back and published more works with Chapman and Hall. So you can see sort of an interesting distribution there. So that had me thinking more about just publishers in general, and if we take Dickens out of the equation and take a step back and look at all the authors and all the publishers, what will we see about the trends in these different publishers? What's going on with them? So the first thing let's do is just take a look at sort of total title trends across the period. Now the database is meant to be from 1837 to 1901, but there are some sort of values here on the edges, I guess, that have snuck into the database. I'm not sure what that means. But if we look at just that general period here, we can see in general there's a rise, right, of titles. So more and more titles in this category being published over the course of the century. Now, if we take that trend and we break it out by publishers and rank those by sort of highest volume to lowest volume, we're going to get a more interesting visualization. So here I've got a line chart with number of titles published by year, and each one of these rows is a different publisher, and it's sorted from top to bottom. So we can see, Hurston Blackett's at the top. They've published the most. What's interesting about that is you can see that even though they published the most titles, they didn't really come on the scene until the 1850s, versus, let's say, Bentley and Chapman, where they've been sort of a steady presence throughout the period. Now, another interesting thing you'll see in here is some data points like the Tinsley brothers, like these really dramatic curves where you start with like one title and then you're up here publishing 40 titles in a year, which is higher than like a lot of these more established publishers, and then a decline suddenly again right back down, ending with like one last title in 1887. So I actually looked them up and put a little link here to some information about them. Turns out they went bankrupt in 1888, and that's why their last title came out in 1887. So you can see some pretty clear sort of rise and fall of their business venture there in the publishing world. And you can find more examples that have those similar type of curves if you scroll through these various publishers. Now, another thought I was wondering about is, what about when do these people write? When do these authors publish? Can we look at sort of the age distribution for when authors were writing these books? And so here's sort of a breakout, an approximation of how old someone was when their novel was published. That's not the same as when they authored it necessarily, and that's something we need to keep in mind. But we can see in general, it looks like sort of the window from like early 30s to late 40s, maybe early 50s is sort of like the max, the peak period kind of here, and then on the outskirts of that is a little bit rare. Now, you'll see some weird data points here. You'll see like 100 and 108 and 122, and clearly that can't be right. And that's because we don't really have the year the works were authored, just the published year. And some works are published posthumously, so you'll see this calculation doesn't make sense because this title was published way after someone had already died, and so they weren't actually 122. They would have been 122. I tried to remove that from the data by just like capping things by people's death year. So basically saying like, hey, if you published this, if this published dates after their death year, then just like use the death year. And so it's not totally accurate, but at least gives you a better, kind of removes those outliers and gives you a better understanding of that data. Now, if we break this visualization out and actually do this by author, you'll see some interesting things. So this is actually sorted from high to low for the authors based on number of titles they released. Null anonymous is the most, and we'll remove that later. And you can see there's no data because we don't have birth years and death years for authors who we don't know who they are, so we can't calculate their age distribution. But we can see people like Emma Marshall, who's the most prolific writer of that time period in terms of number of titles, and Evelyn Green and her work, and you can see she published 14 titles in a single year. And you can also see some of that capping I did kind of pop back in the data. Like William Kingston, for example, did he really publish 21 titles at the age of 66? No, if we like filter to William Kingston, what we're going to see is that that was the year that he died. And so my capping is sort of put all of the 21 works that were published after his death onto that single year. So that's an example where the capping actually kind of hurts our analysis rather than helps. But it also sort of gives you a perspective on you can look at some of these big bars at the end and understand immediately, oh, this is an author that had many titles posthumously released. A couple other things I want to show I was looking at in here is, so what's in a name? So the anonymous thing got me thinking, and I think the alt name field is like really interesting, and there's like a lot of cool, weird metadata in here. So if we look at sort of the total title counts for all the authors, we'll see the players we've already kind of seen here, as well as this null anonymous field. Now, maybe we don't want to know about the anonymous ones. That's not really helpful for ranking, so we can just remove that in a few ways. We could, just say like, don't use anyone that has the word like anonymous in their name, and we'll remove that from our selection state and just look at these authors and get a better view. But I also thought it would be interesting to explore like, who are the authors that have used pseudonyms and not used pseudonyms. So for example, if I look at the alt name field, all the pseudonyms are kind of tagged here in the data. And I could go back and try to like use some SQL to pull that out into another flag. It'd be useful, but just for quick analysis, I could do something like, just let's look at everyone that has pseudonyms. It's 706 of results here in this alt name field, and I can select that, and here are the authors that have ever published under a pseudonym. And so I have that information now. Or I could do the opposite. I could say like, let's not do people that have pseudonyms as part of their alt names, and we get a completely different list of authors here to look at. And that led me to another question, which was just like, how many authors actually ever used pseudonyms or didn't? And so I have a visualization here that just kind of breaks that out, a very simple one. In blue here we have about 832 authors that at some point had published with a pseudonym according to the alt name column in our data set, and then 3,000 that never used a pseudonym. The last thing I want to show that I thought was kind of interesting was going back to sort of the publishers, and specifically that volume breakdown. I showed that in the filter grid, this whole distribution of like, 1 and 3, it's kind of bimodal, and it's kind of interesting to me. I'm assuming it's sort of like, if you're going to publish more than one volume, you might as well go to 3, and not stop at 2. But if you take this kind of pattern and kind of break it out across multiple demographics, like the publishers and gender of the authors, it's actually not that repeating. There's actually various different patterns that pop up. So here's a visualization. It's got the publisher name here, and we've got that's sorted high to low by number of titles. We've got the genders broken out across the top, female, male, and unknown for authors that we didn't know much about them. And then we have the volumes here. And you can see that original pattern in some places, like with the fourth largest publisher by titles, F.V. White here, has that similar kind of 1 and then a drop to 2 and then a higher rate in 3. But actually the top two groups, Hearst and Bentley, actually have a trend where they were publishing lots of kind of 3-volume collections here. And also a high collection of female titles as well. So you can see that Hearst, was publishing, 576 titles that had 3 volumes from female authors versus just, about half of that for male authors. And so it's interesting here to come and see kind of how these patterns shaped out for the top 2 most prominent publishers versus maybe some of the ones lower on the list that didn't have as much success. Interesting enough, the Tinsley brothers from before kind of followed a similar pattern. But as we saw in the information there, weren't as successful with that. So you want to check out this data more, check out this website, the Circulating Library. It's really useful, and I'll include a link in the comments. All this analysis was done in Knarr, a data exploration tool that you can go and kind of create these kind of notes very quickly. This is free to use, free to try. So I encourage you, if you're interested in data exploration, go and sign up today and give it a run.